Hello. First off, hi everybody. Welcome to Fix Your Airflows or Send Me More Spoons. Hope you guys are having a great AxeCon. If you are checking out the recording, thanks so much for being here. And without further ado, let's get rolling. All right. So I like to start my talks off with a roadmap. So today's roadmap, we're going to start off with intro, moving into cognitive disabilities. Next, we'll be talking about preventing errors, then communicating and fixing errors, and wrapping it up with a conclusion. On my roadmap, items 1 and 2 are pretty close to the beginning. 3 is kind of 1/3 through. 4, closer to the end, and conclusions right at the end. So that's the expectation for today's content. I wanted to start off and quickly do an Indigenous land acknowledgement. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that I am presenting to you today on the unceded ancestral land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. You can learn more about whose Indigenous land you are on by visiting native-land.ca. Again, that's native-land.ca. For those of you who are in Seattle, work in Seattle, or know people who work in Seattle, I encourage you to check out the resource realrentduwamish.org. From their website, Real Rent calls on people who live and work in Seattle to make rent payments to the Duwamish tribe. Through the city, though the city named the Duwamish leader Chief Seattle Thrives, the tribe has yet to be justly compensated for their lands, resources, and livelihood. So all money that's donated goes towards the Duwamish tribal services and to support the revival of the Duwamish culture and the vitality of the Duwamish tribe. Awesome. And with that, let's get going. So for introduction, hi. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Shell Little. My gender pronouns are she and her. You can find me at Twitter at Shell E Little. I'm on a hiatus right now, but you can still find me there. Tweet at me. Anything you like for the talk today, would love to hear about it. I will be checking Twitter after the talk today, so please feel free to engage with me there. I am an accessibility specialist. I'm an inclusive designer. I'm also a speaker. Speak about cognitive accessibility, just accessible design, inclusive design, and then also game accessibility. So I live in Seattle, and I'm partnered, and my kids all have tails. So I have ADHD. For those of you who know me, you know. For those of you who don't, it's probably not that hard to guess. On top of ADHD, I have a lot of other really big names and words that go with how my brain works. On the screen right now, I just have a large jumble of words, such as a brain injury, photophobia, nerve damage, dyscalculia. There's a lot of things that goes with being disabled. But for me, I say that I am neurodivergent. I also identify as disabled. For me, those words are empowering. So why this topic? Well, generally you can track my talks by something pissing me off. Like something pisses me off, I write a talk about it. So, but in reality, I've been working on forms for 5 years. I previously have been in fintech, so 5 years of serious form work. So I've seen some stuff. But why does this topic matter? Well, this topic matters because disability rights are human rights. And that should really be the end of this conversation. But, and I love this tweet from Eric Bailey. He tweeted out yesterday. My good friend Eric says, it's okay for accessibility work to be specifically for access needs and not as a frame to sell more things to more people. And I absolutely agree with that. And I wish that's how it worked and how it was that easy. But users with cognitive disabilities are at a higher risk of form abandonment due to barriers. Users with cognitive disabilities rely heavily on error flows to protect them from mistakes. Eric's tweet aside, unfortunately, there is a universal business case to make, about bad forms. Nobody likes good forms. In terms of cart abandonment, due to 2022, some data found in 2022 for reasons for cart abandonment, they found that 17% of cart abandonment was just due to bad forms, too long, complicated stuff. And they found that better checkout designs, they can reduce abandonment by 35%. And that translates in the United States e-commerce market to $260 billion in recoverable orders. And for me, I'm thinking about small businesses or companies that are selling small products. We can help them make more money, support themselves by having better forms. Also job applications. 60% of job application seekers, they abandon online job applications because of length or complexity. And when you think about that, that's, typically neurotypical people being asked. So I can't imagine how high those numbers are for people with disabilities. Over 67% of site visitors will abandon forever if they encounter any complications. So there's a big problem with bad forms. So I saw a lot when I was doing my research. Forms stand between users and what they want. And I would disagree. And I would say forms stand between users and what they need. Let's make them suck a little bit less, especially when we're thinking about forms. Everything's on forms: banking, access to education, access to healthcare. When you have forms that are, something a user can't finish, people from access to serious care. Awesome. Section 2. Let's talk about cognitive disabilities. So let's talk about some definitions. So when I'm talking about cognitive disabilities, what I'm talking about are things like dyslexia, autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, TBI, epilepsy, Tourette syndrome, aphasia, those kinds of things. And people with those disabilities, they deal with, limitations of attention, comprehension, memory, and problem solving. And when you think about forms and filling out forms and being asked for information, having any four of those things compromised can make finishing a form virtually impossible. I'd also like to highlight mental health disabilities. When I'm talking about those, I'm referring to anxiety, depression, PTSD, borderline personality disorder, bipolar disorder. People who have those, myself, I have several, they have issues with emotional regulation. That also includes patience, working memory, executive function, and trust. And again, when we're thinking about forms and thinking about medical forms and bank forms and loans, those kinds of things, those four elements, when you're struggling with any of those, it can make really confusing forms just a showstopper. So according to 2019 data, there are 15.8 million people, adults in America, with cognitive disabilities. And that's pre-COVID data, which is saying a lot. So the numbers of people with cognitive disabilities is around twice the population of New York City. So think about New York, bustling, cars, noise. Now double the people who live there. And that's the people in the United States that we know of, A. B, pre-COVID numbers, and C, we know that a lot of disabilities that are cognitive related are underdiagnosed. So things like anxiety, depression, and burnout are all types of mental health disabilities. Not everybody who has anxiety and has depression will consider themselves disabled, but they still are part of the spectrum of disability. So on the screen right now, I have some tweets in reference to stress and anxiety. I have a tweet from someone that says, the stress of existing every day is becoming too much. I desperately need to fill out the form to get health insurance in MA so I can see a mental health provider, but I'm so stressed I've been procrastinating on the form for 3 weeks. It's so says, I'm tired, I'm confused by this form I have to fill out, and I'm too stressed to process new information. And this is a common theme that we're seeing. A lot of us aren't doing well. In terms of ADHD, I have 2 tweets on the screen as well. It says, the ADHD, I think, urge to avoid filling out a single simple form that will probably only take me a few minutes. I feel that because we've been burned so many times by bad forms. The anxiety of starting a new form, it gets to you. Another tweet says, I'm filling out a form. Next thing I know, 5 minutes had passed. I was staring at my phone. I honestly couldn't remember what made me pick it up. I realized I had literally been in the middle of typing a word. I got distracted in the middle of a word by nothing. Working memory, being able to focus, impulsivity are all things that I personally struggle with. Next, brain frog. I once in a presentation said brain frog instead of brain fog. And I think that was very perfect because if anybody has brain fog, you get it. And I don't like this frog, so I put evil eyebrows on him. So I have a little image of a smiling tree frog, and now he has angry eyebrows. I don't think it's good. I have a large tweet on the screen right now that does a good job describing what brain fog feels like. The worst part of brain fog is that you're actually aware of your brain bandwidth becoming so narrow that you can't even navigate a short sentence or a simple task. When, if it lifts, having a functioning brain again is a massive relief. For many people, brain fog does not lift, or it lifts partially or intermittently. Watching yourself be foggy is a torture in itself. Everything is harder, and people don't understand why you're suddenly dumb slash forgetful. You don't even know if it will end. It may not. Brain fog lifting is the mental equivalent of having 100 kg removed from every limb, the gag taken out of your mouth, the lights turned on. Suddenly you can absorb, evaluate information, and decide what you're going to say next on the fly with mental room to spare. And what people are starting to talk about more is COVID. A large symptom of long COVID is brain fog. So thousands and thousands of people are now experiencing brain fog for the first time. I have 2 tweets on the screen. My hashtag long COVID brain fog makes doing complex, unfamiliar tasks like filling out FAFSA forms nearly impossible. It should have taken an hour, took 4. And despite reading all the info and looking up the answers on the Gov website, I screwed up. I just want to give up, but moms can't. Another tweet says, COVID brain fog. Shortly after recovering, I couldn't remember my bank account number, the one that has been the same for 20 years. I asked Brian, but as he said the numbers, they immediately disappeared from my mind. He ended up having to type it out the form I was filling out. So mental health crisis in the pandemic it's a thing, and people's brains are struggling to chug through all of these new sensations of brain fog, of disability, basically. So 4 out of 10 adults have reported symptoms of anxiety and depression, and that's 4 times more than pre-pandemic. Over 1/4 of mothers reported the pandemic has majorly impacted their mental health, and 24% of parents reported being diagnosed with mental health conditions since the start of the pandemic. So those going into the pandemic with mental health concerns are at the highest risk of things like burnout. The call is coming from inside the house. Burnout contributing factors for people who are neurodivergent are things like change in routine, like working from home, not working from home, loss of external social-based structures, and having to find new coping strategies. So, things are tough right now. And let's talk about spoon theory, because it's really important to talk about spoon theory when we think about the way our brains change and shift, and our spoons change throughout the day. So for those of you who don't know, spoon theory is a metaphor created by Christine Miserandino, used to describe the daily amount of mental or physical energy a person has and the toll of this energy. Now, spoon theory is something used by especially the chronically ill community. They're an amazing community that has been very empowered by this. So making sure not to appropriate this, because everybody has spoons, everybody has energy, but this concept is that, it just takes more energy for a disabled person to exist. So everyone has that finite amount of spoons, but being a disabled person living in an ableist world, it just takes more spoons to exist. So I have a chart on the screen right now. I'll go through it quickly because we have a lot of content to cover. But someone who's not disabled wakes up, morning routine and transit to work, 2 spoons. And we're working out of 10. Now, when they go to work, takes 3 spoons. Hard day. Back home, transit, 1 more spoon. When that person gets home, they have 4 spoons left too. Make dinner, go grocery shopping, pick up the kids, pay bills, things that you need to do as an adult after your 9 to 5 sucks, 3 spoons out of you. Now, somebody with chronic pain, morning routine takes 2 spoons. Transit, another 2 spoons. They're dealing with a high pain day, so everything is a little bit harder. Work, 4 spoons because they have that extra spoon being taken away from them from the pain. Transit, on the way home, they were so low on spoons, they actually had to pay for a lift home. So I have an asterisk on that star because that's what we like to call disability tax, because you have to pay more to be alive and be disabled. When they're home, they only have 1 spoon left. So unfortunately, they had to buy dinner. So they weren't able to cook a healthy meal for themselves. They had to buy something quick. And that cost them more money. And when they sleep at night, they don't get all those 10 spoons back because they had a high pain night. And when you think about that process in which our brains shift and our brains move, there are things called, I like to call them spoon sinks, any task that eats away at spoons at a disproportionate rate. So barriers that I bump into that will suck me dry are, I don't know, look back at my previous talks. I'm kidding. But like motion is one that really sucks me dry. I refer to it as a spoon sink. But in general, ability is a sliding scale. What you can do at 9 in the morning, 9 at night. And that's especially true for disabled individuals. So, when you start off at an 8 in the morning and then you go down to the 2, what that can actually feel like. It goes from, a bad design or something that's made inaccessible can feel like a poke, but at the end of the day, it can really feel like a slap. And when spoons are low, mistakes happen. Users need us to think about them when they're at their most vulnerable, when we're designing products for them. And with that, let's talk about preventing errors. Let's see how we're doing on time. Oh, awesome. Right on time. All right. The best way to help users with errors is to prevent them. That's amazing, right? So let's talk about simplifying repeated actions. It's AT to me. What we think of as assistive technology is subjective. So I always like to think, and I like to say that fish think that scuba gear is really fascinating assistive technology. So for me, what assistive tech is to me versus somebody who's blind, for example, or somebody who's deaf, for example, what we view as assistive technology is very different. So oftentimes these things that we think of as like nice to haves, like that's good UX, they can really be make or break for someone with a cognitive disability. So some examples are, when we're talking about forms specifically for forms of, oh gosh, like forms of forms. Common form assistive technology for cognitive, there we go. Browser autofill. So having your computer hooked up in a way where you have your browser set up to know your information for you. I use that heavily. Remember my address, remember where I'm at. I had brain fog, so I've lived in the same house for a couple of years and I could not remember my address. I was like, I can't even remember what it starts with. So relying on autofill is a big deal. So, when we're talking about WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the criterion identify purpose is specifically for this. So it enables, make sure to enable users to rely on browser autofill by giving each element correct autocomplete attributes. So I have a link at the bottom. It's not helpful, but Mozilla has a really great article about the different types of autocomplete attributes, things like name, street address, birthday, postal code. So by tagging your elements appropriately, it helps the browser help your user. The less your user has to do, the more you can automate, the less errors. So another one is like things like LastPass. Making sure that users cannot have to remember their own password is huge. So a lot of people use that for short-term memory, for brain fog, for lots of things. Things like copy and paste allow users to paste content into form elements. I don't want to have to type things out. I'm a human. I will have error. Copy paste from a form to, from a PDF to a form, that's not going to get messed up. Next up, biometrics. I've worked on several biometrics projects in my previous role, and it's a huge assistive technology when you think about it. People can use Face ID, they can use thumbprint. There are ways for people to log in without having to type, without having to remember things, because they're able to use something that's secure off of their phone. So things like biometrics can be considered an assistive technology. I also am a huge fan of alternate logins. So things like patterns. I'm an Android user myself, and I love the patterns. Like, don't ask me to remember a 4-digit code, ask me to remember a shape, and I can do that. So when you have the ability to think about alternative login methods, it's a really great assistive technology for a lot of people with cognitive disabilities. My personal favorite alt login is QR codes. So with today's technology, a lot of times we have apps on both, mobile and desktop. And by being signed into one or the other and being able to use QR codes makes life a lot easier. Discord, for example, I have 3 computers in my home that I use for 3 different reasons. And being able to toggle back and forth between Discord is really great. I scribbled out my Discord because I love y'all, but don't creep on me. So don't log into my account. But you're able to use your phone to scan it and use that as a method to show it's me. Awesome. Let's talk about form structure. So a form is like a conversation with your user. A previous manager of mine, Kevin Kalahiki, told that to me once. It was told to him by a mentor, and it really stuck with me because you're asking a user to provide you information. It's a conversation back and forth. So when we have things, like maybe doing them single or multi-step, there's a lot of conversations about that. For me, consistent studies have shown that pages that have 4 questions max have better user retention rate by as high as 26%. So for me, like, break up your forms, my God. When we talk about things like cognitive load, we talk about things like overstimulation, which a lot of people with cognitive disabilities struggle with. When there's too much content on the screen, I get overwhelmed. I have sensory processing disorder, so my eyes check out. They're gone. So by limiting the amount of questions we have on a page and making it multi-step, we're able to simplify it and allow users, to actually potentially get through the forms themselves. On that note, if your form is really complicated, I love the pattern of progressive disclosure. So that's where a user's choice then determines what content will be shown to them down screen. And when you have really complicated flows, banking, progressive disclosure really comes in handy to keep that visual noise down. So when forms are too complicated, only show users information they actually need to be shown at that time. I'm not saying that everything should be, only one question at a time, but when you have questions that the selection will significantly change the path a user is taken down, it's best to not show them until they need to know. So when we're talking about single or multi-step forms, be sure to, if you do go for multi-step forms, be sure to communicate steps, progress, and status. You always want to tell a user how many steps they have for retention and for people to actually finish. We was part of a lot of really big studies about the way progress steppers work and the way that we communicate to users. Users want to know how many steps ahead of time before they get in too deep so they can evaluate their spoons, their time, their bandwidth. A big thing that I talk about a lot when I'm working with designers is clarity over click reduction. So there are 2 things that just really bother me that are, artifacts of an older time, and it is the concept that we must reduce clicks at all cost. I understand it is better to simplify, but if something is complicated, it needs to be given the time it needs. So reducing clicks at all costs and avoiding anything under the fold, that second one, they're outdated concepts. So under the fold as well, that one, we have to make sure everything's at top. Under the fold concepts, that's how we got carousels, and they're the worst. So, that's not necessarily true anymore. So if things are complicated, given the steps they deserve, and it's not about putting everything above the fold, it's putting the right information above the fold. So making sure there's clear labels and there's clear instructions, not everything has to be jammed together. Awesome. Next up, the WCAG criterion, headings or labels. So by building a good form, create structure by using headings to group questions into bite-sized batches. So if it's name and you need first and last, use name as a major heading and then use first and last as a sub. Typically you can use definition lists for that, but I'm not a coder, I'm not gonna get into it, but by grouping the data together, you make it a lot easier for users to fill out content. It's easier to parse, it's easier to feel less overwhelmed when there's good heading structure. Awesome. Next up is settings and communicating form logic. So pick logic and rules that favor the user, not your system. I think that's the biggest pain point for me is when working with, product creation and working with designers, is when we run into tech constraints, just like tech constraints where it's like, oh, the backend system can't handle this, or, oh, our systems aren't set up like that. But, when it comes to things like MMDDYYY, when you're filling out dates, can your user send in any format, or does it have to rigidly be MMDDYYY with slashes, only slashes? Why not? Can you guys not clean up the data? Maybe that's a bigger question that needs to be talked about, because your users shouldn't take the brunt of you having bad systems. So think user first logic. So like things that I like to ask myself, and I encourage you to ask yourself, is this really required? Like, do we actually need this from the user, or is it a nice to have? Does this information live elsewhere? In a lot of UXR that we did, consistently, our clients always said it was infuriating when they were asked content they knew we had. So what's your name? What's your address? What's your company? What's your, like, things that you already know should be leveraged. You shouldn't be asking users the same questions over and over and over and over. So, does this information live elsewhere? are text parameters enough? So are you asking somebody, I saw while I was researching, how does ADHD affect you? And it had a 30 character limit. Like, are you kidding me? I could give a whole dissertation on how ADHD has affected my life. You give them 30 character limits. Also, are they, when it comes to text parameters, are you viewing the world through a lens of whiteness and only thinking of names that have, minimum 3 characters? Because in other countries, there are people who have names that are 2 characters long. My partner has a name that has only 1 character. So when if you look at Wells Fargo product on my side, the stuff that I worked on, everything always allowed names to have 1 character because my partner has 1 character. It causes us endless problems when he has to also put his last name or middle name in there because they won't accept 1 character. So make sure to broaden the way that you're thinking about character counts for names. And also, are they short enough? Like, are you putting a no character cap on things that have rigid character caps? And can they use any format, or do they need to use specific formats? So make sure we are communicating expectations to users. Those who need it will seek it out. So the information's there. Those who need it will select that button that has more information. They will hit that help button if they are a user who wants it. So talking about things like labels or instructions, the WCAG criterion, it's the concept of giving users clear instructions to help them succeed. So I basically say, if you set a constraint, you must communicate it. Someone is picking the logic, the interaction rules, the queries that will limit certain types of character intake. If you are doing that, it in there on before users have to deal with errors. Totally. So in this example right now I have on the screen, I have an account number. It has 1 through 9 typed into it. And below it says, enter account number. So that could potentially be robust enough, enter account number, or it could be useless. Like I know it's enter account number because the form is labeled account number versus below it, I have the same, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, but it actually has a format requirement. So XX dash 3X's dash 2X's. Why you would need that, I have no idea. I would also argue that the backend should be able to clean that up for the user. So the user shouldn't have to rigidly only use that format. But if your system has those, constraints, make sure it's communicated to the user. Like Microsoft, I had beef with Microsoft for a bit because when you live in Seattle, everybody, all roads lead to Microsoft. But while applying at Microsoft, they had they don't accept special characters. And I had worked for a company that has an ex ante GUI on it. And it just told me invalid. And I think I cried. I'm pretty sure I cried because I couldn't figure out why it wouldn't accept this text because I had an ex ante GUI on it and it wouldn't accept a special character. And I was livid. It took me like 3-4 hours. I think I tried twice to try to figure it out. So when you are putting those parameters on there, be sure that not only users know ahead of time, but we'll talk about it afterwards. But once the error is triggered. Awesome. Required fields. So clearly indicate what elements are required and stick to that method. On the screen, I have a very classic, required fields are marked with the asterisk. But there are other things to do. All fields required. There is the opposite way where everything is optional, or if it's optional, it will be listed as optional. So assume it's required. I don't care what you do, stick to it, be consistent. Don't switch from page to page. If you're going to say everything's required unless otherwise told, don't switch to the other method. Stay consistent. And when it comes to long form user assistant content, UA content, my old manager, Gerard Cohen, always used to say, UX is like a joke. If you have to explain it, it's not good. And I know that sentence it's typically talking about UI, but it's true for UX. It's true for UA. If your flow is so complicated that you have to have a massive user assistance content bundle with it, then it's just a bad flow. Like you have other things to worry about. At that point, UA is a band-aid and it's not helping. Awesome. Communicating and fixing errors. Oh my gosh, I thought the time was 39 and I was like, oh crap, but it's 29, we're great. Awesome. Let's talk about error handling. And I think this is not going to be groundbreaking stuff. I don't know if anything of this is that groundbreaking, but it's important to think about these things from the lens of people who have low spoons, people who are dealing with brain fog. So errors work best in context with their triggering elements. I know, shattering, but inline error messages didn't used to be the norm. Oftentimes they were balloon-based messages, which is a problem within itself. So showing the error next to the element it's triggering helps with limited working memory. So on the screen on the right-hand side, I have two examples of form elements. One says account number, and it has ABC in it. Instead of showing the inline error, it is a balloon that pops up and it says, here are some instructions you won't be able to refer to while typing. So unfortunately, while someone's trying was wrong with it is now gone. They don't have access to the balloon, or if the balloon's open, it's blocking. So making sure that the instructions are able to be viewed at the same time. So I have below it account ID, and then it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then it has the ID must be, and then I have a format, just a fake XX dash format. So it's letting the user know, hey, this is what's wrong. We put a parameter on it. We're giving you the line error message. This is what's wrong. This is how you fix it, so that a user can see it at the same time. And then I think, yeah, we're talking about here. Great. So then in terms of error identification, another WCAG criterion, if an input error is automatically detected, there is indication and the error is described in text. So really, really important thing here. Obviously, we're telling people how to fix their errors. We are not saying things like invalid, not good, like that's not helpful for a user. So in this example of the form element, I have accounts must be 8 digits long, because this the example I have goes up to 9. So there's 1 too many digits. So accounts must be 8 digits long. And if you obviously, if you knew that, it should say it beforehand, but also make sure it's still said after and not just error. And then keeping in mind when people with cognitive disabilities get overloaded, they're really looking for these keys and these clues to fix things. Like I've definitely been there when I'm feeling overloaded with a red screen. Awesome. So using color to indicate errors is really great. It's fantastic, but be sure that color is not being used alone. So on the example I have, the border is red. It's bolded out from where it normally would be. So we've got a change in shape, a change in color. We have our icon that has an exclamation mark, like a triangle, like whoa. And then we have content next to it as well. And all of it's red. It's good because for me, like I was talking about previously, when I get overwhelmed and overstimulated, sometimes I can't read. And sometimes I can only see color. Sometimes I can only look for shapes. I can't tell you the amount of times I've clicked on the same color as another app that I'm actually looking for. Obviously not everyone can perceive color, but for me as somebody who can, I rely on it heavily. Next WCAG criterion, error suggestion. So be sure the error text is helpful and doesn't remove instructions. That's something I see quite often, where you leave a field blank and you tab out of it and it says field is required. Cool. But did that field have parameters beforehand? For example, if this account number had that XXX blah, 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 if it had that form requirement, now you've replaced that hint text with field is required text. And now a user is going to get another error because they're not going to get the form right. So when it comes to error suggestion, be sure that your errors include things like format. Is it MMDDYYY with dashes, slashes? I don't really care, but make sure your user knows. And I didn't mention it at all in this talk, and I'm realizing it, but don't use placeholder text for instructions. Just don't. I don't even know. For me, it's so not a thing to do. I didn't even think to put a slide for it. Just don't use placeholder text. It sucks. Awesome. Consistent identification, another WCAG criterion. So after picking the method that you're going to use to show errors, stick to it consistently. On the screen, I have two different form elements that are an error. One has the thick red border with the red exclamation mark, field is required. And the next one has dashes around it. And then an X, account must only be 8 digits long. If you're going to show a user that something's wrong, be consistent with it. Don't throw in a bunch of different icons. Make them mean the same thing. And that's true, in consistent identification as a criterion in general, is if you pick a language to talk to your user in, for example, these yellow icons mean warning. You best be using those every single time. It doesn't make sense to then use that for something else. That's something I constantly had to check designers on, was like, hey, you said this meant this on this page. It has to mean the same thing on the next page. Awesome. Okay. There are situations where an error flow would be needed. So an example, I worked on a product, we were doing check capture. And in the check capture, the design changed a lot. But one thing, I worked with the brilliant Tori Clark on this one, now at Airbnb. What we talked about a lot was the concept of error flows. So when I'm referring to an error flow, I'm referring to a separate flow that takes the user out. So for example, in capturing checks, if you take, you're taking 4 pictures, front and back of 2 different checks. When you're done, it isn't always best to dump the user back to the original page and say, hey, you had an error, something didn't work, you're at the beginning, rather than, we had multi-check capture. So like in this example, let's say there's 6 checks. That's a lot, that's 12 images, but only one of them didn't work. Sometimes it's best to design a flow where they only fix the one that's broken, instead of having them to dump back at the beginning, try again. Oftentimes there is a better way to take someone slowly and kind of like hand-holding through the error flow process. It's not necessarily true for forms, because they should be in line and right in front of you. But there are other situations where user input is required to remove that, remove what is an error, keep the good stuff, and then have a user just fix that. So check capture is an example that I can think of for that. I'm sure there are more. Oh, this one's super controversial, but another big thing is keep the primary call to action enabled. I don't care what the primary CTA is. I don't care if it's continue, submit, go, whatever it may be, do not disable it. When you disable that, so when I say disable, I mean typically it's either disabled by default or it becomes disabled if a user triggers an error. The problem with that is when a user gets to the bottom of the page, they are left on what I like to call an error scavenger hunt. So they're forced to scroll up, scroll down, scroll all over the place to try to find the errors. That's a really big problem. Not to mention, through study, we did find some users with cognitive disabilities specifically trigger all the errors to know what elements are required and what aren't. So they'll scroll to the bottom, select the go button, and then work through the errors. Personally, that sounds like a hellscape to me, but everybody's brain works different. Give users instructions is a really big one too. If an errors are found, be sure to send users to a helpful message, that ideally has the number of errors found. So when they hit that button, that go button, then, potentially, like say server-side errors, which I don't even want to talk about, certain errors are thrown, bring them to the top of the page and present them with a good message. Things like, this page contains 5 errors, or please fix these 6 errors before continuing to the next page. If you know the number of errors, give the number of errors to your user. And okay, this is my last slide before my conclusion, but server-side validation is a big sticky point, because sometimes calls have to be made on selection. So another big reason to not disable the primary CTA is because of server-side validation. So you force a user to play error scavenger hunt with their forward-facing errors, with the inline errors, and then they finally get the go button, the primary CTA, to enable, only to hit it to then get hit with more errors because of server-side validation. So make sure you keep that in mind when you're designing that. Like, server-side validation should be seamless, but it can't always be seamless. It drives me up a wall personally, but what are you gonna do? But yeah, make sure to keep that in mind. And awesome. So in 1, forms stand between users and what they need, not necessarily what they want. 2, users with cognitive disabilities rely heavily on error flows to protect them from mistakes. 3, ability is a sliding scale, and we need to design with that in mind. 4, the best way to help users with errors is to prevent them. 5, things that seem like nice to haves are oftentimes make or break for somebody with cognitive disabilities. 6, forms are like a conversation you have with your user. Keep it simple. 7, when building in logic, put the user's need first. 8, errors work best when they are shown in context to the triggering element, rather than I have seen flows that trigger server-side errors, or they tried to do this before I stopped it, but they tried to trigger server-side errors on step 6, the last step. They're like, then we'll check the server. And I'm like, and then send them back to 6 other pages? Oh my God. Make sure you're showing them in context. 9, use clear language that never leaves the user guessing or stuck without instructions. Replacing important format information with this field is required doesn't help anybody. And 10, hire, speak with, listen to, and pay disabled people for their time and expertise. That's it for me. Thank you so much. Again, you can find me on Twitter at Shell E. Little. You can also email me at contact@shellelittle.com. I'm on sabbatical, like I said, right now, so probably won't hear back from me, but when I'm able to, I will check there. So yeah, thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you so much. With that, we'll dive into the Q&A section. So our most upvoted question is this one. Thoughts on input masks? Do they help, or do they end up creating more confusion than they aim to solve?
Oh, input masks. Yes. Richard Steinberg and Tori Clark, who did a presentation. I'm pretty sure it was for, I don't know, XSU. I'm so sorry, Tori. I know you're, but regardless, feel free to check out Richard Steinberg and Tori Clark did a lot of research on input masks. For me, I think it's a requirement to have them revealed. I like to say, it's not 2001. People aren't like lurking in bushes to steal your data. It's going to be bots. It's going to be other things. It's not going to be because you set your phone down for 10 seconds. Working against security for, like, say, password reveal, we were able to get past that because we had a timer. So it was only visible for a certain amount of seconds. I think that is unnecessary because I don't think that data security should be at opposition of usability and accessibility. But there are things. But for me, I think that input masks should always have a reveal. Especially when we're thinking about things like, we got social security numbers, passwords, and credit card numbers. Those things are numbers, and numbers, like for me with this calcula, are really hard. Also, I hate the ones like never make input mask reveals that have to be held. Like you let them go and they're gone. Make sure they're toggles so that a user has the time they need to process it. And, I always say, if you put timers on them, which you shouldn't, you're going to affect the users who need that the most. The users who need to see their password and need it to be revealed are the ones who need more time. So, think about that when you're designing those. But I'm not a huge fan of input masks in general.
Great. Next on the list, how do you feel about Material Design's idea of using a placeholder text as label and instruction, but floating it up when typing?
Yeah, I personally don't mind that pattern. I think it looks kind of slick, as long as it's programmatically good and it works well with assistive technology such as screen readers. I don't have beef with it per se. My only thing would be in terms of the micro interaction, make it quick. Like I have seen some that are just like, woo, like I'm just like, it's not a magic show, like move faster. So I have seen some that they try to be frilly and fun when it comes to micro interactions, which you can check. I have I think I did micro interactions last year. I don't even remember. Time's a construct, but I have previous talks on micro interactions as well. But make it quick, make it concise, but yeah, other than that, I think they're totally fine. Obviously, as long as you're just not using traditional placeholder text, because typically it doesn't pass color contrast, and the second you start typing, it's gone. So if you have first name in there, and I start typing my name, I'm not going to know what I was typing. S. Is it my full name? Is it just my first name? So but I'm cool with the material design stuff.
Great. Next up, what's your take on form summaries, especially those that allow a quick link back to edit?
I love them. I also totally forgot to mention error prevention, which is, I just think everybody should have basically your review page, your last step before you go. I think it's tough because I've seen them done so many different ways. So say you're after a form that has 8 steps and you're filling out for like a loan. When you get to that last step, being able to review all that content, I do think that the best way to do it, especially if we're talking multi-step, is to allow, it's basically to use sections and use appropriate information architecture to let users know like this was step 2. So if you're reviewing step 2 content, giving a quick link back to go to step 2, I think is really important. It just gets tricky when you're thinking about progressive disclosure, or not progressive disclosure. I could give a whole talk on multi-step forms alone, just with the complexities of linear versus nonlinear. But I think if we're talking in a linear sense, I think if you're on that review page and users want to edit, if you have the technical capabilities to allow users to edit there, that's obviously better. But if you can't, which I have unfortunately seen flows where you're not able to edit right there, you do have to go back to that previous page. I think quick links are a requirement. Users should never have to push the back button repeatedly to get back to the page where they need to make an edit. So for me, in some, allow users to edit right there, or at least give them a way back.
This has been an emerging trend of the questions. So for what you were saying around progressive disclosure, how does that fit in for screen reader users?
Okay, so I will say I do not consider myself a screen reader expert, subject matter expert. I don't like code. I'm not a coder, so I can't speak. I can speak to screen reader technology, but it's not my expertise. I think when it comes to progressive disclosure, if you cannot make screen reader technology happy with what you're building, then throw it away. When it comes to screen reader users, their blockers are very important. And, if you can find other ways to make it work for someone with cognitive disabilities, I would never want someone with cognitive disabilities, their needs to be put over somebody who's a screen reader user. I do think it works, from my understanding and when I've worked on it, it's worked really well. So, Leonie Watson said, I think it's Leonie Watson said that when it comes to, updating content, as long as it's updated downstream, it's okay. You should never update content above. So if a user is making a selection and then something populates below them, I don't think that really needs to be announced to a screen reader user because they're going to get there anyway, versus things like if you are using progressive disclosure I guess that's not really progressive disclosure, but filtering, for example, letting a user know what's left, like you have 6 options because you just filtered a table. That kind of downstream content, I think, should be read to a screen reader user. But when it comes to progressive disclosure, a lot of times it's hidden because no one needs to know what's next. And as long as it's appropriately put into the DOM, it's in the tab order, I think it should be fine. I'm sure somebody who's has more expertise in screen reader technology could front me, but from my experience, we haven't had a problem with making progressive disclosure accessible for screen reader technology.
Great, thank you for addressing that. So next up, and we probably have time for about 1 or 2 more questions. The next question is, are inline error messages and a general error message at the top of the form good UX, or does it become too verbose?
I think it's beyond just good UX to do both inline and error message at the top. I think it actually is accessible. Like there's criterion that you are satisfying by doing that. I don't think it becomes too much, obviously keeping in context, if it's a sign-in page, for example, that you can get away with potentially not having that. We call them feedback components, or some people call them message boxes. You can get away without doing that because inline will handle it. But if you have a long form or a form that has more than 4 elements, giving a feedback is a really great thing. Like I said, allowing users to know how many errors. When we're thinking about cognitive accessibility, we're thinking about things like good communication and, instant feedback to users, but we also need to think about screen magnifying users. So if they're at the bottom of the page, by sending a user back to the top to that feedback message, that box, we are bringing their focus back up, giving them a place to start, putting them back at the top so they're able to then work their way back down the form. It's also research has shown with screen reader users that is a preferred behavior as well. So I'm not going to say every situation has to have a feedback component or like that message where like you have so many errors, because I'm sure there are some where, there's only 1 or 2 inputs, or it's a special type of situation. But when you're thinking about classic, like healthcare, banking, those kinds of like really generic, I think they're critical.
Great. So that does put us right at time. One question that I do want to address that has been coming up a lot in the chat has been regarding slides. Slides will be available after today's session, so check back on the session page. But Shell, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your expertise. It's been such a fascinating discussion, so I appreciate it so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks everybody for being here. And for those of you who finished the recording, congrats.